Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. We actually are radical feminists, many of us at least, the epitome of TERFs. Our analysis of gender identity ideology has been consistent since Janice Raymond's book, The Transsexual Empire, in 1979. We were not surprised when this new attack on women came along, and we have not changed our analysis. In 2018, we wrote a declaration on women's sex-based rights, which lays out our position and has been signed by 39,165 people from 160 countries, and it is supported by 542 organizations. Our declaration states, and I'm reading verbatim, recent changes replacing references to the category of sex, which is biological, with the language of gender, which refers to stereotyped sex roles in United Nations documents, strategies, and actions, has led to confusion, which ultimately risks undermining the protection of women's human rights. States should maintain the centrality of the category of sex and not gender identity in relation to women and girls' rights to be free from discrimination. States should ensure that the words woman, the word girl, and the terms traditionally used to refer to women body parts and bodily functions on the basis of sex continue to be those used in constitutional acts, legislation, in the provision of services, and in policy documents when referring to persons of the female sex. The meaning of the word woman shall not be changed to include men. That was Article 1 of our declaration. So to promote this declaration and sex-based rights for women, we have volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent. Please join us. You can also become a member of WDI to help our work by volunteering or donating. You can contact info@womensdeclaration.com or via your country contact on our website, womensdeclaration.com, for more information. Our program today is focused on a very sensitive topic, child sexual abuse, with speakers from the UK, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. We will have Anna Fisher, Susan Harrison, Maureen O'Hara, and Jill Raymond. We will start with Anna Fisher. She is a co-founder of Nordic Model Now, and she will be speaking about British culture, the British establishment, and the grooming gangs scandal. So over to you, Anna, and thank you very much for being here with us.
While we share the widespread horror at the treatment of the girls in these scandals, we're concerned at the very narrow focus of much of the debate, public debate, in particular, the idea that this is a completely alien behavior that was brought to this country by immigrants from Pakistan, a country with a terrible record on women's rights, and that it was a fear of being branded racist that was the major factor that led to the police and other authorities turning a blind eye. While there may be elements of truth in some of these assertions, they detract from factors intrinsic to British culture and the institutional failings that made what happened practically inevitable. They also deflect serious consideration about how to prevent something similar happening again. We fear that any public inquiry instigated in the current climate amid the public calls for vengeance would be unlikely to bring about the change that is so urgently needed. It's seldom possible to understand a deep-rooted social problem without understanding its history. There are many strands to these scandals, including the unique nature of many of the communities of people of Pakistani descent in the north of England. I draw on Finding a Voice, Asian Women in Britain by Amrit Wilson about some of this history, and later on I will draw from Homebreakers to Jailbreakers by Rahila Dutta of Southall Black Sisters. Most of these communities have their roots in the large wave of migration to the UK from Pakistan after the Second World War, peaking in the late 1960s, They mostly came from rural areas of Pakistani Punjab and Azad Kashmir, where they lived in tight-knit villages with an almost feudal economy and strict patriarchal social structures. This is a recent photo of Azad Kashmir, so not representative of what it would have looked like in the 50s and 60s, but it gives a sense of the terrain. While women were at the bottom of the pile, they were surrounded by women of multiple generations, which provided solace and support, and sometimes a counterbalance to the collective power of the men. The men responded to calls to help rebuild the British economy after the Second World War and found work in textile mills in Lancashire and Yorkshire, engineering industries in the Midlands, and light industry further south. Typically, the men would come first and only send for their families once they were established, sometimes years later. When their wives arrived, they typically lived in poor accommodation in rundown areas. Unlike their husbands, who learned English at work, the women couldn't speak English, and as they mostly stayed at home, had little opportunity to learn it, and they often became very isolated. This was in stark and painful contrast to their lives back home, where they lived in multi-generational extended families, contributed to work on the family farms, and often had freedom to move around their villages where everyone was kin. Meanwhile, the social changes of the swinging 60s were forging ahead in Britain, with women adopting skinny tops, mini skirts, and hot pants, and racism was rampant, all of which would have tended to make these migrant communities who valued modesty turn inwards. The police widely tolerated prostitution in the rundown areas where these families typically lived, and along with racism, sexism prevailed. The Yorkshire police spent the entire 1970s failing to catch the prolific serial murderer of women known as the Yorkshire Ripper, mainly because they failed to listen to all the women who had near misses with him and gave accurate descriptions that the police then ignored. But before I go any further, I want to read some testimony from Arlene, a member of Nordic Model Now. This is how she described what happened to her in a Midlands community in the 1980s. I have her permission to share this with you. I quote, "I met my pimp when I was 13. He was 18 and a well-known local drug dealer. I voluntarily had sex with him once or twice, but then he started forcing me to have sex with his friends and other men. I resisted, but there was no escape. They were bigger and stronger than me. My pimp would punch and manhandle me, and collectively they'd block the path that was my only route home from school. So I had no choice but to acquiesce. After that, almost every school day for more than 3 years, and some days in the holidays, between 5 and 10 men would have sex with me and pay my pimp. They were mostly adult men who had flats and houses, cars and wives and kids. Occasionally boys from school would join in, but mostly it was adult men from the local estates and sometimes from further afield, some coming in groups. Most of them were white, as was my pimp. I felt they enjoyed being able to treat me, a young girl, in incredibly inhumane ways. I had the sense they'd been waiting to do this for their whole lives. Sometimes, obviously, they felt guilty and they would try to sweet talk me. But this was usually when they were one-on-one with me. They were all, "You're so beautiful," etc., until it was done. And then they'd laugh with my pimp about what an ugly slag I was. Even though I knew they were lying when they complimented me, it still hurt. The group sex was the worst. This was usually the norm. The men all being verbally and often physically abusive together. It was like a pack mentality. They would want to copy what they'd seen in porn. This added to the danger I was in, as what one man did, the others followed. Over the years, this led to me being spat at by every man there, strangled until almost unconscious, and the men forcing or attempting to force various items, such as bottles and sticks picked up from the ground, into my vagina or anus. They seem to think it funny to try to make me cry, which I never did. My pimp would attempt to force his fist into my vagina as a punishment for doing anything that displeased him. The spitting thing happened like this. I was on my knees giving one guy a blowjob, and one of the guys watching spat on me. Then the guy getting the blowjob laughed and did it too. And then they all took turns to do it. This kind of thing was very common. It was just bearable with the spitting, but when it was the strangling or the cider bottle they picked up off the ground, that was when things started to get really scary. I'd just sort of tune out. I was terrified of being caught, of all the trouble I'd be in, and all the questioning and shaming that would ensue, especially the public shaming. Shame was the biggest thing. I was scared of the guys, especially when they were violent, but the way they spoke to me and treated me like utter filth that they hated and mocked, filled me with shame so deeply that I carry it now. Altogether, it must have been about 5,000 men who raped me over those years. That's equivalent to about 3% of the adult male population of the town. And that was just me. Something similar was almost certainly happening to other girls and young women in the area. End quote. What Arlene endured at the hands of mostly white British men in the 1980s was not significantly different from what the girls exploited by the so-called grooming gangs also suffered. She says that everyone knew what was going on, almost certainly including the local police, but no one tried to stop it or to help her. Colloquially, she was the slapper who deserved everything that came to her. What happened to Arlene and many other women in the Nordic Model Now group was, and still is, British culture, condoned by the British state, a culture in which until very recently, domestic abuse was considered a private matter. Rape in marriage was not a crime until 1991. A culture in which violent, misogynistic and racist online porn consumption is rampant, but practically never acknowledged or talked about. Even though the law has now changed in some areas, attitudes are slow to change, and women are still a long way from having practical equality. There are still widespread attitudes in the police that dealing with rape, domestic abuse, prostitution, and child abuse is not proper police work. Given all this, why should we be surprised that Pakistani men would also frequent prostitution, given its official tolerance in the UK and the patriarchal attitudes in their own culture? And later, as deindustrialization accelerated from the 1980s onwards, and many of the men lost regular livelihoods, why would we be surprised at their turn to pimping girls and young women and exploiting their prostitution and handing them around to rape like trophies, when this is what they saw British men doing with pretty much impunity, particularly given the context of Western-made porn eroticizing and normalizing this behavior, and this meshed so well with the low status of women in their own culture. There will always be people who push at boundaries to see how far they can go. Is that not why we have a criminal code? To make it clear that some behavior is beyond the pale and you go there at the risk of sanctions that can be severe. That's the theory anyway. The trouble is when the law is not enforced, it doesn't work like that. The British state has long allowed the brutal sexploitation of mostly working class girls and women to thrive, and legislation against the perpetrators to go largely unenforced. So surely the British state has the biggest culpability here, because this did happen in full view of the state. The Pakistani gangs, but also the entire burgeoning sexploitation industry and the vicious exploitation of Arlene's prostitution in the 1980s and of so many other women and girls. In the 1980s, to all of this was added multiculturalism. On the surface, it sounds like an excellent thing, but we all want tolerance, mutual respect, and the valuing of all our unique cultures, except that's not how the policy works in practice. Rahila Gupta of Southall Black Sisters explains it like this, I quote, At its best, multiculturalism is a laudable attempt to promote racial tolerance and respect for cultural diversity. At its worst, it challenges neither the structural basis of racism nor inequality. It bypasses the need for local democracy because it relies on self-appointed community leaders who have no interest in social justice or women's equality. The problem lies not merely with the multicultural approach, but with the way in which the notion of community is constructed. Through the politics of multiculturalism, the state more or less enters into an informal contract with the more powerful leaders in the minority community. In practice, community leaders maintain power over family, cultural, and religious affairs of the community, with the effect of concealing power relations between men and women and legitimizing women's subordination. End quote. Now, consider how this concept was grafted onto a police culture that was already considered male violence against women and girls, including their brutal exploitation and prostitution, to be not real police work, and possibly something that the women and girls intrinsically deserve, and that dealt with challenges and wrongdoing by closing ranks and turning a blind eye. The community leaders in these Pakistani communities were invariably male religious leaders. Along with multiculturalism came multi-agency projects, which would give centrality to the community leaders while excluding more radical voices. The end result was often the ever further marginalization and disempowerment of women, while the community leaders would become part of the local hierarchies. So once the sexploitation of girls by men in these tight-knit Pakistani communities in northern cities and towns in particular started to become obvious, the reaction would have been similar to what would likely have happened if it came to light that the sons of powerful white men in the police or local Rotary Club were running a prostitution ring. Or indeed, if it were a powerful white man like Cyril Smith. No one would want to upset the chief constable or the local imam they'd been sitting next to in multi-agency meetings for years. And anyway, it was only working class girls who only had themselves to blame. So everyone would close ranks and not only ignore the problem, but also do everything in their power to cover it up. Anyone who didn't comply with this was obviously too emotionally involved and would be rigorously sidelined. Once they'd done that, no matter what further evidence came to light, they'd have to continue the cover-up because otherwise they'd expose their own complicity. This is how hierarchical social organizations work. In retrospect, years later, they might say that it was because they didn't want to be accused of racism, but this is an oversimplification. To explain it as not wanting to be accused of racism sounds so much better than saying they were just a cowardly pawn who didn't give a fig what men do to children. It also conveniently displaces the blame onto overzealous anti-racism campaigners and promoters of political correctness gone mad. When the situation becomes too big to ignore, what usually happens is that one or two concessions are made, which are presented as solutions to the problem, but that often bring about little improvement or might even make the situation worse. One example of this was the removal of all references to child prostitution from the English criminal law in 2015 and its replacement with the term child sexual exploitation, or CSE. This was in response to a campaign that used the tagline, "No such thing as a child prostitute." The idea was that if we changed the terminology, people would stop writing the girls off as prostitutes and would stop saying it was a lifestyle choice. But of course, changing attitudes and practices is much harder than changing terminology. There have been many unintended consequences of this. It implies that adult prostitution is a lifestyle choice, which we vehemently dispute. It also obscures the fact that the perpetrators sold girls to other men to sexually use and abuse for money, power, status, or some other tangible or intangible benefit. In other words, the motivation was not just their own warped self-gratification, but also financial or other gain, the exact same motivation of pimps who exploit adult women's prostitution. Recognizing this does not mean that we have to call the girls prostitutes or to incorrectly suggest their involvement is a lifestyle choice. But not recognizing the financial motivations of the perpetrators means that we're ignoring an important aspect of what is involved. The girls are not just sexually abused, they're also treated as commodities, as objects, as non-persons that can be bought and sold for another person's benefit. This is human trafficking under international law, regardless whether they were transported from place to place. Like Arlene, they were often raped by multiple men in a single day, often day after day after day. Treating the exploitation of children's prostitution as a fundamentally different phenomenon from adult prostitution means no one needs to think how the two are connected. So instead of seeing a massive interconnected problem linked by men's demand to sexually use and abuse women and girls, and the money that can be made from that, we get something like this. Some small problems that are not connected in any way and that don't require challenging men's demand. This means that nothing fundamental has to change. The police can continue to partner with the big pimping websites and to not enforce the law on pimping and brothel keeping. The government can continue to include prostitution in GDP, and no one needs to think twice when the government invests in Killing Kittens, a company that runs sex parties, or what are more accurately described as pop-up brothels. Yes, all these things are true and happening here in the UK right now. Of course, when paying the sex acts with an adult is considered acceptable, it is going to lower the inhibition to paying for sex with a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old. And what the hell, that 14-year-old is already well developed, so why not her too? It also obscures what is happening in these so-called grooming gangs. It is no accident that in the Oxford case, which came to court before the legislation was changed, there was clear recognition that commercial gain was a key motivation. For example, here is paragraph 21 from the judge's sentencing remarks. I quote, "Quite apart from using her for your own sexual self-gratification, you coerced her into providing sex to vast numbers of strangers. Up to 4 or 5 men would be invited to addresses so they could have sex with her. Men were brought from Bradford, Leeds, Slough, and London. Men would say they had come a long way to see her. AB describes you and the other men who would come as having a pack mentality. You were oblivious as to what was happening to her. Your only concerns were your own self-gratification and the satisfaction of your customers, so you could achieve commercial gain. If she resisted, she would be coerced. Customers would become angry." End quote. The fact that the girls were being exploited in prostitution was picked up at the time by the press, which reported that one girl was sold for £600 an hour. Since the terminology in the legislation was changed to CSE, there has been much less acknowledgement, if any, of this aspect of these cases. Even the otherwise excellent Telford inquiry seemed devoid of awareness of the connections between adult and child prostitution and men's demand for both. It is as if the change in terminology has made people feel that it is somehow improper to acknowledge the reality of the exploitation of children's prostitution and its connections with adult prostitution. Sadly, it seems there is no equivalent inhibition in blaming the girls. There are other examples of how the practice of multiculturalism and consequent pandering to self-appointed male leaders have been discriminatory against women. For example, a law was introduced in 2002 giving courts the power to refuse to grant a divorce if a religious marriage has not already been dissolved. This has been a disaster for women in Muslim and Orthodox Jewish communities, where only men have the power to grant religious divorces. As a result, the British state enables and endorses religious men, preventing their wives escaping abusive marriages. Another example is that during the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement negotiations, the British government succumbed to demands from male leaders of both Catholic and Protestant communities to not extend the Abortion Act 1967 to Northern Ireland as a condition of continuing the negotiations. In this way, the British government violated its obligations under international law to the women in Northern Ireland at the behest of male political leaders on both sides. Another little-known aspect of the current epidemic of sexual abuse of children in the UK is our age of consent laws. Most people assume that the age of consent is 16, and any sexual activity with a child younger than that automatically counts as statutory rape, or the equivalent for other child sexual offences. In fact, this only applies if the child is 12 or younger. You heard that right, 12. If the child is 13 or over, the defendant can claim that he thought she was 16, 18 in CSE offences, and it is up to the prosecution to prove that this is not true. This is a get out of jail free card for men, allowing them to say, I thought she was 16, Your Honour, honest. It is often simply impossible to prove that wasn't the case. In addition, the CPS guidance on consent includes a long section on consent in CSE cases, even though consent is not relevant to these cases. This complicates the prosecution of child sexual offences and is likely a reason that successful prosecutions make up such a tiny proportion of the reported cases. It is beyond time that the law was changed to move the burden of proof in all child sexual offences from the prosecution to the defendant, or even better, to make them strict liability offences. Another issue is that the Modern Slavery Act 2015, the human trafficking legislation in England and Wales, does not conform to binding obligations under international law, particularly as it relates to sex trafficking, which disproportionately affects women and girls. More or less all of the girls exploited in the grooming gang scandals meet the international definition of sex trafficking victims, but not under the definition in the Modern Slavery Act. This and policy based on similar rationale means that latest figures show that in the UK, approximately 3 times as many labour trafficking victims, who are mainly male, are recognised than sex trafficking victims, who are almost exclusively female. If you include criminal exploitation with the labour exploitation, the disparity is even more shocking, as this slide shows. This is skewing the European and even the global statistics, so that it seems that labour trafficking is a bigger problem than sex trafficking. This is extremely unlikely to be true, if only because sex trafficking is obscenely profitable and comes with very little risk, in the UK at least. For example, recent research found pimps and traffickers in the UK can make £20,000 per month per woman or girl, meaning it is many, many times more profitable than labour trafficking. So while we may think that we live in a modern democracy in which women have equal rights as men, the reality is actually far removed from this. Our modern legislation has been grafted onto an establishment and systems that evolved over centuries before women even got the vote. This is demonstrated in our age of consent laws that date back to the 1880s, and the patriarchal nature and values of most of our public institutions, including the police and local councils. Added to which we've had decades of lobbying by well-funded pressure groups for the expansion of the sex industry. We believe that it was their lobbying that resulted in our shockingly sexist Modern Slavery Act, and that led in 2019 to Boris Johnson shelving the excellent age verification legislation that had already been passed. We do not believe that the grooming gang scandals can be fully understood without understanding the limitations in the law and the dynamics that I have touched on. With the culture in the police and local authorities and other powerful institutions remain dominated by rigid hierarchies that value loyalty to the hierarchy, to those at the top, and to men's sex rights, above all else, I fear we are likely to see many more such scandals. We need to change this. We need to change the narrative and the culture. We need to end men's impunity to rape and torture women and children. We need to say no to men, no to men's impunity. We need to say no to men buying sex acts under any circumstances, whether that's online on OnlyFans and the webcamming rooms or in real life. That's what the Nordic model is about. It's about making men understand that they cannot continue in the same way. Men are not babies and they need to begin to act like adults, just as women are always required to do. We need all women to stand together and insist on this. We need to insist on the full enforcement of the law against all third parties profiting from another person's prostitution, regardless of their age or sex. We need to insist that the government updates the Modern Slavery Act so its definition of human trafficking conforms to the international definition. This would mean that the sex trafficking legislation could replace the current CSE legislation. And instead of calling it CSE, everyone could call it sex trafficking, as it is correctly termed in the US. This would make it much easier to successfully prosecute. But before you jump off a cliff in despair, I want to remind you of the words of Alice Walker. Resistance is the secret of joy. Women, we must come together in resistance. Thank you, and please follow Nordic Model now on social media and check out our website.
And now we're moving on, continuing with the very same topic. And we're going to hear from Susan Harrison. Susan is a radical feminist and a recently retired social worker with 35 years working in child protection and adult safeguarding. And the title of her presentation is The Frank Beck Case, a look back to the Leicester Beck Case and some common factors of child sexual abuse and exploitation. So thank you very much, Susan, for being here with us, and over to you.
So I'm going to talk about a case. It was known as the Frank Beck Case, although most properly it should have been known as the Leicestershire child abuse case. And that was down really to a kind of a press strategy to keep the name Leicestershire, which was the local authority concerned, out of the headlines. So to this day, it's still referred to as the Beck case. So this actually goes back right to the beginning of my social work training, actually, which was, I started training in 1986, a 2-year MA course. And I was starting to hear rumours at that stage, although didn't appreciate the full significance of them until some time later. So it was really after all the recent coverage that we've seen around, the so-named grooming gangs in the north of England, and the interest, on many platforms and amongst many women about the sexual abuse and exploitation of children, I was taken back to think about this case again. And I thought it would be useful to, I found myself kind of going back and reading up on it a bit more and learning a bit more about it, and including things I didn't actually know at the time. So the information that I'm going to share with you is from a range of sources, which includes press reports during the trial, which was in '91, personal accounts from some of the victims themselves, other staff members and witnesses that were shared previously. And also there was a book called The Abuse of Trust, which was written by a journalist, I think he was a BBC journalist, Mark Darcy, and a man called Paul Gosling, who I knew kind of, I was acquainted with him, I didn't know him very well. And that was published in 1997 and contains a lot of the detail about what happened. On the 29th of November in 1991, following an 11-week trial at the Leicester Crown Court, Frank Beck was sentenced to 5 life terms for sexual and physical assaults against more than 100 children that had been in his care. And he was also sentenced to a further 24 years on 17 charges of abuse, which included rape, buggery, indecent assault, and assault carried out between 73 and 1986, so a long period of time. Most of Beck's victims were boys, but he also abused some girls, and he was renowned for his extreme misogyny and hatred of girls and women. The 5-life term sentence was, I think it still remains one of the most severe in British judicial history since the ending of the death penalty for murder. And it was unprecedented at the time, certainly. Initially, the trial was to be held in secret, I think because of the sensitivity of some of the information that it was feared would come to light. But there was a landmark case brought by several newspapers, and this ruling was actually overturned, so it was a public trial. So Beck died on the 31st of May 1994, 2.5 years after he'd been imprisoned, apparently as a result of a heart attack whilst he was playing badminton, and he was just 52. There was speculation at the time and subsequently that he may have been murdered, and that's never been proven. And in fact, the inquest concluded that he'd had a heart attack, but would not reveal whether there'd even been a post-mortem. So there's no way of knowing that now. The investigation into Beck began 3 years earlier, in 1989, and this was after a mother who was being questioned about her own parenting, and she disclosed that she'd been abused as a child when she was in a care home that was run by Beck. This eventually led to a very large-scale police investigation, which involved tracing and interviewing dozens of children who'd been in care during the 1970s and 1980s, so very, very extensive. There were also 2 other members of staff who were co-accused alongside Beck, and there was a 3rd man who would have been charged, called Colin Fidderman, but he actually went on the run and he took his own life, and I'll touch on him again later. So at that time, this was the biggest investigation into child sexual abuse that there'd been. So, understandably, there was a huge amount of interest in it. 3 years earlier, so that was 1986, so it was just as I was commencing my training, Beck had resigned as head of 3 children's homes in Leicestershire. And he'd been head of officer in charge, it was called, of these homes between 74 and 1986. And there were several homes in the county that he had oversight over, or was actually the officer in charge of. But more importantly than that, he'd actually gained the status of a guru, and he was a self-appointed expert on dealing with what were then termed difficult children. And one person referred to him as the trusted supremo of children's homes in Leicestershire. So, we're seeing this kind of familiar thing now where somebody gains a situation where they have huge respect, influence, and in his case, a kind of authority and seniority that went way beyond his actual role, which was actually quite junior in the hierarchy, but because of his personal authority that he exercised. He became very important in actually shaping childcare policy throughout Leicestershire. He used to chair a council working party that dealt with the children's homes. That was in '77. And he had the ear of those in power and the confidence of people in power, including politicians. One of the things that Beck did was pioneer the introduction of what was called a treatment for disturbed children, known as regression therapy. And under this therapy, children were reduced to a state of isolation, of intense fear and self-doubt. And in that state, they were very, very vulnerable to abuse and were abused. And an element of this so-called therapy was also to provoke the children to the point where they would lose control and then could be restrained. And that was also seen as an accepted part of this intervention. As well as the children that he abused, Beck also abused at least four members of staff, adults, over several years. And until they did finally speak out, they were also very, very fearful of him and felt powerless to stop him or to report him. And he was also charged with offences against at least two of those people. During the trial, it was described that he'd run what was called a reign of terror over 13 years. And a man, Peter Joyce, who was a QC for the prosecution, said that it was no way of life for these children. There was no escape for these children. There was simply the endurance of it. And one can only imagine, you know, how awful that must have been, because there was literally no escape. You know, they were in care, supposedly being looked after. If they ran away, they'd be returned. They couldn't go back to their own families because they were in care. So, you know, they were in an absolutely desperate situation. And Beck was responsible for creating this very powerful regime. And it was actually a kind of closed system. So there was little outside scrutiny. And in those days, there would have been limited scrutiny in any case. But even with what there should have been, didn't actually occur because he put so many barriers in the way. He would not comply with any departmental procedures. He would not cooperate with the field social workers or other colleagues in other departments. And his managers felt completely unable to manage him or control him in any way. You know, they were also intimidated by him. And that, you know, again, that's a familiar, you know, scenario that, you know, we see now with many people. I think it was probably not so evident at that time. People would not have recognised that in the way I hope they would now. So there was an expert witness who at a compensation hearing. So this was some years after the trial, when some of the victims were trying to secure compensation. And this person said that, in his view, it appeared that what was happening was actually torture. You know, it went beyond what we would normally see as abuse. And it was torture. It was a psychological and physical hurt that was intended to subjugate the victims and gain mastery over them so that they became dependent. And again, I think, you know, that was true of both the adult and child victims. You know, he fostered this dependency. The regression therapy, senior managers were said to be aware of it. So it was kind of it wasn't only just known about, it was actually kind of applauded and seen as very innovative. Despite concerns being repeatedly raised about the methods, and actually if anyone had looked deeper, you know, he just completely bluffed his way into this. He knew very little about therapeutic training. He'd had no training himself. It was just really a cover. And at one point, you know, the managers actually started to become more aware, and they said that this methodology should not be carried out in the homes that Beck managed. But actually, they then failed to take action on any further complaints, and they didn't go and check. So, you know, they just left it to him. And of course, he just ignored that instruction. One of the, you know, I think the factors, and again, this is very, very true today, is that the children who'd come into care for very, very many different reasons. I mean, some of them have been involved in criminal behaviour. Some of them simply had parents that were unable to care for them. But because they were in care and because of their previous histories, they weren't held in high regard by adults generally. So they were often stigmatised. You know, they were seen as being criminals. And we know sometimes children are actually involved and enticed into criminal activity in order to make them less plausible if they ever do complain, because the police or CPS will just think, oh, well, you wouldn't be a good witness because of that. And these children were completely isolated from their families, more isolated than would normally be the case, or indeed other adults like teachers who may have helped them. And again, that was part of Beck's aim, to completely overpower these children, to reduce their own thoughts and opinions and views, and just undermine them in every way possible. And I should say as well, the Beaches home, which is one of the homes he went on to manage towards the end of his career, had its own school as well, so children didn't even get to leave to go to schools outside. So before I go on, I just want to read a few words from the children themselves, because I think it's, you know, it's so important that we hear some of their experiences and their views, which were really not listened to at the time. So what one former resident said: "You were treated worse if you had no backup from others. My mum was banned from visiting because she was supposed to be a bad influence. And they told me she didn't care about me and didn't want me. Another resident said, you would be taken to your room with no one around, and they would taunt you about your childhood, your parents, your sexuality, anything they could think of to get at you. Eventually you'd react and they would pounce on you. She said that children were held down and sometimes towels were placed around their necks or pillows were held over their faces. It was horrific. You felt terrified before it happened. And when it was over, you felt good because you knew you were safe, at least for a couple of days. She said, I will never, never forget what happened in that kid's home. Another said, if he came into a room, you wouldn't have to look around to know it was him. He wouldn't have to speak. He had this kind of aura and you could feel him like static. He was charismatic. There was this real sense of authority, as if he had the power of life or death over you. You would be called into the office and told you were nothing to society. You had no dad. You were a bastard, a slag, a whore. So I'm just going to go on to outline some of the concerns that were raised and the events that actually led to his resignation. So as early as 1975, there was a Labour councillor called Henry Dunphy, and he received an anonymous phone call alleging that children were being seriously mistreated at Ratcliffe Road Children's Home. And he reported it to the Director of Social Services, so he went right to the top. And then he was visited by two senior officers from Social Services, and they reassured him that not to worry, all was well. They were aware of what was going on, and it was all part of the therapy going on. So again, you can see how this therapy was used as a cover. And Beck himself would say, oh, well, children may make allegations, because that's part of what will happen. So they just dismissed it. Now, this man said, he might have been reassured by that, but then he got a threatening phone call from Beck himself. Now, this is a lowly officer who actually rang a counsellor, which would be unheard of, So he rang him, and that was very odd behaviour from an employee to a counsellor. So the counsellor actually, he followed up with a visit to the home. He was very tenacious, and he found Beck to be a very imposing character and using what he termed controlled aggression. I should say, I won't have time to say much or anything about Beck's background, but he had actually been a member of the Royal Marines for about 7 years, I think. And he was also, he used interrogation techniques during his time in the Marines. And I think some of the things he did were probably learned during that period of his life. And he was then working in a children's home. So Beck defended his approach, and after wowing the Social Services Committee, he gave a presentation about his innovative approach to caring for these troubled children. And he got their full endorsements, and at that point he seemed invincible. I think at that time, the council wasn't sure how to deal with, what they saw as very difficult children with lots of needs and difficult behaviours. And Beck seemed to get results. So it was kind of like, oh, great, we don't have to, we can leave that to him. They just looked the other way, basically. Probably very naively, I think, rather than maliciously, although that may not have been the case with every single one of the people that were in charge. But in 1977, there was a young boy, aged just 13, called Simon O'Donnell, and he was actually, he was found hanged. And it was, I think the inquest found that he'd hanged himself. However, other children at the home, including one who later went on to commit murder, he murdered a child later. He said that this, he'd seen the body of this boy being removed, but because of his own criminality, nobody really took it very seriously. But that, he wasn't the only one who sort of cast doubt on that. And probably, my own personal view is on the balance of what we kind of know. It was highly likely that this child had been killed because of what we know about throttling children and just the severity of the abuse that took place. And it was unlikely that he would run away to where he was found. So that that did lead, obviously led to some concerns about what was going on, but not sufficient to really do anything. And then in 1980, there was a foster parent, so I'll just call JW. She raised concerns about the treatment of her 11-year-old foster daughter. And Beck would visit this child in the foster carer's home to give her counselling sessions. And the foster carer was told on no account must you go upstairs, no matter what happened. And this young child would scream and scream and scream and be very distressed, and her behaviour really kind of worsened. And the foster carer was so concerned that she actually made an in-person visit to the Director of Social Services, and turned up at their door. But again, her concerns were dismissed. 2 years later, in 82, Beck was arrested and he was charged with ABH on a 10-year-old boy. And this boy had actual injuries to his buttocks after being struck by Beck. This child actually wasn't even in care, but he was staying at the beaches at weekends on an informal arrangement. And even at that time, that would be very odd to have such an arrangement in place. So Beck should have been suspended because this went to trial and he should have been placed on suspension. But amazingly, the HR department at the time concluded that he posed no risk to children. So he was still in work. And at the trial, the court ruled that the chastisement was reasonable and acquitted Beck of the charges. So there he was. And then later that same year, there was a student social worker on placement, and she complained about the treatment of a girl who'd been dragged around by her hair and struck around the head. And she was very concerned, and she kind of raised these issues. And the manager was asked to investigate this. He was in this kind of line manager. He was a line manager, I think, of Beck. But he failed to actually speak to either the girl herself or the social work student. And often what would happen was people would just speak to Beck, and of course he had every excuse. So there's this consistent failure to speak to children, which in my mind is just willful, not wanting to hear what they might hear if they did. So these children really were just abandoned to their fate. And then in November of that very same year, another junior social worker who was working at the beaches filed a complaint, and she'd been there for about 18 months. And she gave a detailed account of her concerns over that period of time. And again, she tried initially to go to the director, right to the top, because she realised that things might get blocked kind of lower down. But she was referred to the principal officer, which was a sort of relatively senior post, about 3 tiers up from Beck, up and below the director. And her concerns included physical violence, also suspected sexual abuse of boys, and also the verbal abuse of staff, including herself. So she'd been called, racist slurs, sexist slurs on a regular basis, and she'd witnessed other staff suffering the same. And women particularly were the most insulted by Beck. He really didn't like women, so and he encouraged the children not to respect female staff. And at that time, there were 2 other adult witnesses to this who confirmed these allegations. So you'd think that would be sufficient to trigger a major investigation. But yet again, the children were not spoken with and no action was taken. So in February the following year, I think Beck had been on bail while those other, for the first charge. So after he was acquitted in February 83, he was actually approved as a foster carer for 2 teenage boys who were living at the beaches. And when I read that, I was utterly incredulous, really, that should happen. And this was despite concerns also being raised by the father of one of these boys, who had come to suspect that another child was being sexually abused by Beck. But his concerns were kind of overlooked. And then in June that same year, 83, a 14-year-old girl absconded. And she told the police that Beck had hit her, and she also shared concerns about other children. And the police didn't take any action, but they passed the concerns back to social services. And ordinarily, you'd expect social services to still take action because the threshold is very different for them, for them to act than what it would be for the police. But because the police didn't, they said, okay, we don't need to, so they did nothing. And then in March 84, 4 boys were actually expelled from the beaches and thrown out late in the evening. So I don't know what led to that, but they found themselves some miles away and they contacted the emergency out of hours team. And at that point, one of the boys made allegations of physical abuse by Beck and another care worker. But because these children had learning difficulties, some of them were sniffing glue. Their concerns were dismissed because they were seen as not reliable. So yet again, nothing was done. And then in January 85, a 16-year-old boy told his social worker he'd been beaten and sexually abused. And this time the information was passed to the deputy director. But he thought, well, nothing could be done without a formal complaint being made, which is just astonishing because the complaint had been made. So the police were not informed. And it's very, very hard hearing this not to think that there was some level of active cover-up, because I think this goes, in my mind, it's a very personal view, goes way beyond just negligence. There were more allegations in August by another boy, and the police investigated this, and they concluded that there had been accidental touching of the boy's genitals, and the council didn't carry out any further inquiry. But then in November 85, a social worker on placement wrote directly to the director to report concerns. And again, nothing was done. In 86, there was a complaint of sexual abuse, and that finally ended Beck's career in Leicestershire. And this complaint was abuse against 2 of his staff, which I think had gone on for several years. And on the 4th of March of that year, Beck was suspended. And once he was suspended, there followed more allegations by different people. And not long after that, later that month, Beck actually resigned. Now, his resignation shouldn't have been accepted, because then he could walk away, but it was accepted. But unbeknownst to the council, the police at the time were conducting another investigation, but they weren't given the information by the council, because if they'd added all that together, possibly Beck would have been charged at that time, but that didn't happen. And after Beck had left, he was actually given a reference by the director of the council at that time, a different person to when he'd started. This was a man called Brian Rice. And this enabled him to take up jobs in other areas with other authorities where it seems he did continue to abuse children. And then he was finally arrested in 1989 following the disclosure by the mother. And that then went on to lead to the large-scale investigation and the trial. So I deliberately haven't kind of gone into too much detail about what these children endured, because it is just really horrific, and it's hard for people to hear, I think. But you can see, I think, from what I've said, just how extensive and horrendous it was. And the themes here are, the vulnerability of children and how they come to be vulnerable, how their concerns are dismissed and not taken seriously. Abusers are allowed to continue abuse because of the failures of the system. And children were told that no one would believe them. They were told that no one cares, including their families, that they're worthless. They were often threatened that worse things would happen to them if they told. So one girl had been in a psychiatric unit, which is closed now. It's called the Towers, and quite a notorious place. And she was threatened that she would be returned there if she told what had happened. Another girl, was a lesbian, and she was abused because of that, and also because she'd witnessed Beck abusing a boy. And he said to her, "I'm doing this to you because you need a man." And he raped her. He had no interest in women sexually, but he raped this teenager several times, multiple times, because of this, as punishment. So there was a mix of different ways that he would, with boys he would often ostensibly show them affection and give them gifts and so on, and create an emotional dependency. And with girls it was just sexual violence and physical violence, and really putting them down. So I'll just come on and say a little bit about some of the common themes that we've seen in, you know, we're now very familiar with subsequent cases that have hit the headlines. So the first, I think, is status, authority, and charisma. And we know that, you know, perpetrators will often seek out positions of authority and trust that gives them unchallenged access to children. You know, we saw this with Jimmy Savile, with many people. And sometimes those positions are quite relatively modest. So being a school safeguarding lead. But again, within that school community, it gives somebody, you know, it's a position of trust. And, you know, they're the person that people go to discuss safeguarding concerns. In Beck's case, he found expertise in this therapeutic intervention. And he had, you know, what was seen as a distinguished career in social services. And he was very highly regarded across the nation, not just locally. He had, you know, he would receive visitors to the home, local councillors, the director, and even, I think, Virginia Bottomley, who later went on to become the health minister. She visited once because these homes were held up as, like, you know, the paragon of child care practice. So he abused children really in plain sight. And at the trial, the defence his defence said, you know, to the jury, said, could you really accept that nobody would stop Mr. Beck when everybody could see what was going on? You know, and he said, what we've heard is just so terrible. Can you really believe that if something was so terrible, surely somebody would have seen it and done something? So that was actually used against the victims, the fact that these things happened in plain sight. And the fact that we often, I think we struggle sometimes, things are so horrendous that the best of us can have utter incredulity that people could do such evil acts with impunity and so extensively. And of course, abusers kind of, you know, they reckon on that, and that helps them get away with what they're doing. Beck flaunted his disrespect for those in authority. He disregarded the hierarchy. And that meant that he was, you know, he had carte blanche. He was able to handpick the residents. So he chose which children would come, the most vulnerable children, the children that he was interested in. And also he would take children to stay with him in his own home.
But moving on to our next speaker, Maureen O'Hara, whom we know very well because she's a member of WDI as well. She's a legal academic and radical feminist activist. Her activism focuses mainly on defending sex-based rights and challenging the sex-trade exploitation of women and children. She is a co-author of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. And Maureen has a talk with the title Child Sexual Abuse, Denial, Minimization, and Victim Blaming, which links very well with the previous talk by Susan. So Maureen, thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
What sparked off this webinar really, and our decision to have it, was a lot of the discussions that have come about in the public domain in relation to the what I would generally call grooming gangs. I think they're more accurately called pimping gangs because that's what they are. They were pimps. So they're all pimps. They all traded girls. They sold girls to the men. And that's something that, as Anna pointed out, often gets overlooked. And in the UK, the recent discussion was partly sparked off by the uploading to social media of a court document relating to the rape and pimping of girls and young women in Oxford. It was the judge's sentencing remarks, which Anna's already mentioned, and those sentencing remarks discussed some of the assaults and young women talked about in some detail and described them. It was published in 2013, but it's only been relatively recently, I think, that many people have seen it because it was uploaded on social media. And sentencing remarks aren't generally, you know, made available so easily to the public. The girls were deliberately degraded. Beyond the sexual assault, there were other types of degradation which were very deliberate and carried out by groups of men. And on some occasions, they were abused in particularly sadistic ways. And I think that, partly because of that, the so-called discussion of the so-called grooming gangs has caught public attention in ways that other forms of child sexual abuse haven't. People were shocked and horrified, I think, by the abuse described in the judge's sentencing remarks. And I think that some of them reacted as if the extreme forms of abuse detailed by the judge were unique to that particular form of child sexual abuse and to gangs of that kind, to organised abuse of that kind. But they're not unique. And the forms of abuse that Anna's already talked about and Sue's already talked about show that. Sexual abuse of children in other contexts often involves deliberate degradation of different kinds and sadism. The report of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which was published in 2022, that was a national inquiry in the UK, very wide-ranging, and it looked at a lot of different types of sexual abuse in different contexts and spoke to many survivors. And it states that the accounts of victims and survivors who were heard by the inquiry showed that, and this is a quotation, many of the acts perpetrated caused agonising physical pain. So sadism, deliberate causing of extreme pain, is often a feature, often happens in child sexual abuse. It's not unique to one particular kind of sexual abuse. Survivors of child sexual abuse and those who work to challenge it, whether as activists, practitioners, or researchers, know this. They're familiar with that information. But many of the general public don't. And so I think many of them who did read those sentencing remarks were very, very shocked. Rightly so, and understandably so. But I think what the public needs to know is that this is widespread, and this type of sadism and this kind of extreme abuse of children takes place in many, many contexts. And all of those contexts need to be publicly discussed and challenged. If we're going to be able to seriously challenge child sexual abuse in all its forms, the public need to know how prevalent it is, and they also need to understand its root causes. And as with sexual violence against women, its most significant cause is male dominance. Sexual abuse is a way to exercise dominance, essentially, and its perpetrators are overwhelmingly male. Whether it's committed against children or adult women. The 2019 crime survey for England and Wales found that 92% of respondents to the survey who'd been sexually abused in childhood said that those who had abused them were exclusively male. They weren't all adult men. Abuse by children and particularly boys has been increasing in recent years. In 2021, the crime survey showed that between March 2017 and March 2020, 98% of those who had experienced rape since they were over 16 reported that the perpetrators were male. As I've said, the sexual abuse of children in the UK is increasingly perpetrated by other children, usually boys, who now have easy access to online pornography showing the abuse and degradation of women. And that's something that should also be a national scandal and widely talked about, but it hasn't been. A large proportion of child sexual abuse occurs in the family environment. And according to a report into intrafamilial child sexual abuse by Sarah Scott, written for the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse, that accounts for almost half of the child sexual abuse offences reported to the police in the UK, or rather in England and Wales. Those figures relate to England and Wales specifically. And most of the abusers where abuse is carried out within the family are male. And that includes other children within the family, often older brothers or other male relatives. Sexual abuse often takes place within institutions, and that's something Susan's talked about in relation to Frank Beck, and those include churches, schools, sports clubs, children's homes, secure accommodation for children where children can be very vulnerable. It's perpetrated by organised networks, including pimps who make money from the sexual abuse of children in the sex trade, whether in prostitution or in pornography, which is now more commonly called child sexual exploitation. And increasingly, it also takes place online. While class and cultural factors like religion play a role in shaping the patterns sexual abuse takes in particular contexts, and that was the case with the grooming gangs about whom there's been a lot of discussion recently, but I'm not saying that their cultural and religious beliefs were irrelevant, but I think the key driver of what their abuse of children and the key driver of all abuse of children is sex-based oppression, it's male dominance. The nature and the prevalence of child sexual abuse was first brought to public attention in the UK by feminists who at the time broke a long-standing taboo about talking about it publicly. The first feminists to talk about it were the first wave. I was probably talked about earlier, but the first wide-scale discussion was during the first wave in the 19th century. And those feminists campaigned against the sex trade and the sexual abuse of children. They campaigned, for example, for the age of consent to be raised. It was 12 at the time of their campaigns. Then was raised to 14, and it's now 16. And they also understood very clearly the links between the sexual abuse of children and the sexual abuse of women in the sex trade in particular. The knowledge they brought to light, though, was largely lost in the first part of the 20th century. And then it was again brought to light by second wave feminists in the 1970s and 80s. During the second wave, many women met in women-only groups for the first time and began to talk about their experiences of sexual abuse, including their experiences as children. Rape crisis centres and refuges for women and children escaping domestic abuse were first set up in this country by second wave feminists. And within those spaces, women started talking to other women without the presence of men, often for the first time. And they talked about their own experiences of abuse, including child sexual abuse, and also their children's experience of sexual abuse from their abuser. So that was one of the reasons, one of the things that fed feminist campaigns against sexual violence and led to feminist campaigns around child sexual abuse, which were quite common in the 70s and 80s. The true extent of child sexual abuse is impossible to measure because most children don't report the abuse when it's happening, and only a minority of adults report it to any official agencies once they reach adulthood. There have been two major prevalence studies in the UK, well, in England and Wales. I keep saying the UK when really the data relates to England and Wales, which is a separate jurisdiction from Scotland and from Northern Ireland. Those two studies were carried out by the NSPCC and the other by the Crime Survey for England and Wales, which is a regular survey asking people about their experiences of crime. They've reached very different estimates. Those two studies were reviewed by Karika Karsner and Liz Kelly for the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse in 2021. And they concluded that, taking into account the variations in prevalence study data in England and Wales, overall it suggests that 15% of girls and young women and 5% of boys and young men experience some form of sexual abuse before the age of 16, including abuse both by adults and by under 16s. They also say that that's likely to be a very significant underestimate. They say that official data vastly underestimates the scale of child sexual abuse because most of it remains hidden, is not reported to any official agency, and it's not uncovered usually while it's happening. Where it is reported, that's often when the victim survivor is an adult. Not all suspected cases are recorded, and not all reported cases are visible in the published data, whether that's in criminal justice data or child protection data in the civil law context. And also recording practices vary a lot between different agencies and between different geographical areas, and they vary over time. But one thing that all researchers seem to be agreed on is that the data that we have usually underestimates the extent of the sexual abuse of children. And the Crime Survey in England and Wales, which I mentioned earlier, asked people about their experiences of child sexual abuse and found that 1 in 5 of those who said they were sexually abused as children had never previously told anyone until they spoke to the people carrying out the survey. Less than 10% had told official agencies about their abuse at the time it was happening, and about 25% had reported it to agencies at a later date. The most common reasons that people gave for not telling anyone were embarrassment, fear of not being believed, and fear of humiliation. And fear of not being believed and fear of humiliation are very well founded, because that is, in many cases, if not most cases, what's likely to happen to them. Like all forms of sexual abuse, the sexual abuse of children is enabled partly by denying its existence, denying how commonplace it is, minimising its significance, and blaming its victims or framing them as liars. And that has happened historically throughout most institutions. Today, no one can plausibly deny that child sexual abuse exists at all. So what is often denied is how prevalent it is, how universal it is, in fact. It's committed by men and increasingly boys of all ethnicities and religions and all class backgrounds. And one way that this can be explicitly or implicitly denied is by framing it as being committed mainly by men from particular backgrounds. Focusing mainly on a particular group of abusers on the basis of their ethnicity or religion can be a way of denying the universality of child sexual abuse, and also denying that its roots are in wider male dominance within society. And I think that's been happening with some people in the recent debates in the UK. That many of the people talking about the pimping gangs have focused almost exclusively on the fact of their religion and their ethnicity. Have said very little about the male dominance involved and any links to other forms of male dominance and dominant male behaviour in other contexts. Another way in which the universality of child sexual abuse is denied is by framing abusers as a distinct group who are fundamentally different in nature from other men. And one of the ways in which this happens is by calling men who sexually abuse children paedophiles. That's often used in a way which implicitly or explicitly suggests that they are exclusively sexually interested in children and are therefore different from the majority of other men. That's not true. Most men who sexually abuse children have relationships with adult women who often they also abuse, either sexually or in domestic abuse, or both. And some have relationships with other men. And many abuse both children and adults. Amongst the most common forms of abusers are men who abuse within the family, and they often abuse their own daughters or other family members. Those are men with adult relationships, their fathers. So their interest sexually is not exclusively in children. And I think the use of the word paedophile to talk about all men who sexually abuse children, rather than limiting it to those who have an exclusive interest in children, and there are men who are like that, and tends to obscure how universal sexual abuse is. If we don't see the universality of child sexual abuse and the significance of male dominance in giving rise to it, we can't fully understand it. And if we don't fully understand it, we can't develop effective strategies for preventing it and challenging it. To understand child sexual abuse, we need to see its connections with men's sexual abuse of women. They're both part of the same continuum of male violence. The pimping of children in child sexual exploitation isn't separate from the pimping of adult women. Both are integral to the sex trade. In the 19th century, in upmarket brothels in England and Wales, young girls were auctioned, publicly auctioned within the brothel, and were marketed as virgins. This was to wealthy men from often the higher echelons of the establishment, many of whom frequented brothels, particularly in London. And those there were brothels who were particularly aimed at that clientele. At that time, girls, usually working class girls, were traded between men as openly as adult women. There was no welfare state and few laws which could be used to protect children from sexual abuse. So the links between the sexual exploitation of girls and women by the sex trade are now less obvious, But many pimps still coerce and exploit both girls and women, and sometimes boys. Many sex buyers actively seek out girls and young women. I know this because I grew up in a red light area, and it's absolutely the case. Every time I went out of the house for a period of a few years, from the age of about 13, I was harassed by sex buyers. And they targeted young women and girls. They have a particular interest in young women and girls, but not an exclusive interest. They're not paedophiles, but they have a particularly strong interest in young women and girls. And pimps target young women partly for that reason. They can make more money from them. And because they're often easier to manipulate and control than adult women. Pornography, which is created from the sexual abuse of children, now often called child sexual abuse images, is an integral part of the wider porn trade and is often marketed by the same organisations. According to a 2021 publication by CEDAW, which campaigns against the sex trade, they published a document called Expose Big Porn, and they talked about the search tags that are allowed or were allowed at the time by Pornhub, a massive purveyor of pornography online. And those search tags included babysitter, young, virgin, little, tiny, extra small, and barely legal. The document or their report also lists the titles of some of the videos, but I don't even want to repeat the names of them, so I'm not going to. But the search tags give you a pretty good idea of what the men using Pornhub were looking for. And Pornhub was quite happy to provide it for them. Some of the images that in those videos are adults dressed to look like children, but much of the porn that was up there was actually porn involving the sexual abuse of actual children. The links between adult and child pornography are rarely explicitly recognised in public discussions. The change of wording from child pornography to child sexual abuse images is helpful in one way because it makes the nature of the images very clear. But at the same time, it's helped to obscure the links with adult prostitution, so adult pornography, sorry, in much the same way as the change from using phrases such as children abused through prostitution, which used to be used in the 90s, to child sexual exploitation has helped to obscure the links between the prostitution of adults and of children. And I don't think it's any accident that those links are being obscured. The fact that these connections between the sexual abuse of children and of women are not widely recognised is one aspect of the denial of the nature of both child sexual abuse and the sexual abuse of adult women as an expression of male dominance. Other forms of denial come into play when children report sexual abuse or adult survivors report it and seek accountability from their abusers. The general public have been shocked by the fact that the agencies which should have protected the girls who were sexually exploited by pimping gangs and should have held their abusers to account often didn't do so. Social services and the police often denied that the abuse was taking place or minimised it by seeing it as consensual, even though many of the girls were below the age of consent, which is 16 years, and they'd specifically reported rapes and other sexual assaults and described them. The inquiries into child sexual exploitation by organised gangs in Rotherham and Rochdale described the police as blaming the girls and young women who reported abuse. They looked down on them and saw them as slags, which is a term of abuse for women seen as loose, for anyone who's not familiar with English slang. Their contemptuous attitude was partly related to the young women's class backgrounds. They looked down on them for that reason as well. And the public are rightly shocked by these institutional failures, but many don't realise that this kind of response from institutions also happens in relation to other forms of sexual abuse. And Susan has described that very well and the ways in which it can happen. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse states that the inquiry heard how difficult it was for many victims and survivors to report what was happening to them and how many were ignored or not taken seriously. One of the areas which the inquiry looked at was abuse within institutions, and among others, they looked at the response to allegations of child sexual abuse on the part of clergy in the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales and in the Church of England, and in the response to the abuse of children in local authority care in Nottingham City Council and Nottinghamshire County Council, and also in Lambeth Council, and Lambeth is an area in London. And the report said that common themes relating to institutions were that the deviousness and cruelty of perpetrators was limitless. Children were threatened, beaten, and humiliated. Those with disabilities or other vulnerabilities were often deliberately selected for that very reason. And the data suggests there is a higher rate of sexual abuse of children with disabilities than of other children. And the report goes on to say, protection of personal and institutional reputations above the protection of children was a frequent institutional reaction. Statutory agencies were not informed, perpetrators were moved on, and there were failures by those in authority to thoroughly investigate allegations. Records about child sexual abuse allegations were not kept. And that was widespread throughout many different institutions that the report looked at, or the inquiry looked at, I should say. One of the inquiry's case studies related to a Church of England bishop called Peter Ball. He was cautioned for gross indecency in 1993, and then a caution is like a warning. To receive a caution for a criminal offence, you need to admit that it happened, but it's not the same as a prosecution. And he pleaded guilty to further offences in 2015. Those included indecent assaults, and he admitted abusing his position as a bishop to sexually abuse 17 teenagers and young men. One of the young men, Neil Todd, ultimately committed suicide. And the inquiry states that at the time, the church discounted Bell's behaviour as trivial and insignificant, displaying callous indifference to Mr. Todd's complaints. The inquiry also looked at institutional responses to allegations of sexual abuse and exploitation involving people who were publicly eminent. And it states, several cross-cutting themes recurred throughout the investigation, including undue deference by police, prosecutors and political parties and others in public life, differences in the treatment of wealthy and well-connected individuals as opposed to those who are poorer, more deprived and without access to networks of influence. And that's very clear from what happened with Frank Beck. Professionals' responses were influenced by the class backgrounds and the social status of victims and of survivors and of alleged perpetrators. And that's the theme of many inquiries into child sexual abuse. One institution with a long history of denial and minimisation of child sexual abuse is the criminal justice system. There have been serious attempts to change attitudes within the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, and amongst the judiciary in recent years, and they've been successful to some extent. But traditional attitudes still linger. Till 1994, something known as a corroboration warning was required in all sexual offence cases under the common law. That's law made by judges rather than by Acts of Parliament. This was a warning that the judge had to give the jury that it was unsafe to convict a defendant in a sexual offences trial solely on the basis of the uncorroborated evidence of the complainant. The complainant is the person bringing the allegation. The warning applied to both adults and child complainants, and if it was not given, the defendant would automatically have the right to appeal. Corroboration is independent evidence, which is independent of the word of the complainant. The requirement for the corroboration warning was essentially an expression in law of the view that women and children frequently lie or fantasise about sexual offences being committed against them. And it was often given in a way which explicitly expressed this. This is an example of a corroboration warning given by a judge at the Old Bailey in 1976. He said, "It is well known that women in particular and small boys are liable to be untruthful and to invent stories. And the corroboration warning was often started with that phrase, "It is well known that." They thought it was well known because it was constantly stated by other judges. In fact, it's nonsense, and it's very clear from research that false allegations are very rare. They do happen, as with any type of criminal behaviour, but they're very, very rare in relation to sexual offences. In addition to the corroboration warning, a range of common law rules made it difficult for young children to give evidence at criminal trials. They were often seen as not competent to do so. That was changed by the Youth Justice Criminal Evidence Act 1999, which states that a witness of any age should be seen as competent to give evidence unless it's proven that they're not competent. But the position before 1999 meant that very young children wouldn't be allowed to give evidence, and therefore they could be sexually abused with impunity. There was no comeback in the criminal law because the children couldn't give evidence. So unless the sexual abuse of the child was witnessed by somebody else who was willing to report it, it would not go to a criminal trial. Law and guidance relating to child witnesses has improved significantly since the 1999 Act. But giving evidence about child sexual abuse is still an ordeal, which is often made worse by the cross-examination tactics of defence advocates. In his sentencing remarks in the Oxford case, the judge said, "Each of these 6 young girls have shown enormous courage in coming to the Old Bailey to give evidence, knowing that they would be accused of lying, knowing that they would have to relive their ordeals, knowing that they have not been believed by the authorities in the past." When a defendant pleads not guilty, it's inevitable that the witnesses giving evidence against him will be accused of lying, or at least of being mistaken. But there are ways in which defence lawyers have traditionally cross-examined witnesses which have been extremely traumatic for those witnesses, particularly in trials involving sexual offences. The central purpose of adversarial cross-examination is to undermine the credibility of opposing witnesses. And research studies identified strategies for doing this, which are frequently used by advocates across different common law jurisdictions, all of which have adversarial systems. Louise Ellison, who's a legal academic who studied different types of ways of giving evidence, has said that victimological study of criminal trials proceedings has revealed the extent to which cross-examination is used as a tool to humiliate, intimidate, and confuse opposing witnesses. These practices have been gradually modified since the 1999 Act and the guidance which was written to accompany it, particularly in relation to child witnesses and vulnerable adult witnesses. And that includes witnesses giving evidence about sexual offences. However, defence lawyers still use them when they think they can get away with it, often, as the following quotation from a QC, the criminal QC, shows. He said, "But there are barristers still who defend who simply want to destroy a complainant." And I mean that. They know that if they can turn her into a snivelling wreck or make her look a complete tart, they will win their case. And it's wrong. And Section 41, is talking about the 1999 Act, has gone a long way to stopping that. But people still try and do it because that's the way. That's quoted in a book by Jennifer Temkin called, and Barbara Crahay, called Sexual Assault and the Justice Gap. Question of attitude. Now, he was speaking in 2008, and things have improved considerably since then. The kind of strategy will probably evoke disapproval from juries if it's used with very young children, but it can still be used in subtle ways, or relatively subtle ways, when the complainant is an adult woman or a teenage girl. And it is still used in more subtle ways than that particular barrister described, but it still happens.
Excuse me, you're very close to your time, so maybe you could wrap up for. Thank you.
How long have I got? Sorry, I haven't properly kept track.
Well, you're over, but I think you have a minute or two to wrap up. Yes, thank you.
All right, I'll wrap up. Okay. Okay, just to finish, and in relation to allegations of rape within the criminal justice system, for many years there's been a very, very low conviction rate for rape in particular, Of the rapes reported to the police, an average of about 1 to 5% result in a conviction. Cases drop out along the way, either at the police stage, the Crown prosecution stage. They often drop out before trial. When they reach trial, the conviction rate is not significantly lower than with many of the types of sexual offences. But what happens is that they're filtered out at the earlier stages, and what helps to filter them out is police views and Crown prosecutors' views of which women and girls will be seen as respectable and credible by juries. And that's still happening. It's still, although probably less the case now with young children in particular than it is with adult women and teenagers. The conviction rate for child sexual abuse offences is relatively high once they get to court. For many offences, the lowest conviction rate is for rape, as compared, for example, to the production of child sexual abuse images. So the lowest conviction rate is for rape, and that's partly, I think, because of the reasons that Anna referred to in relation to issues of consent coming up, where defendants are accused of raping under 16s. Even though they can't validly consent to sex in law, issues of consent and the defendant's belief in consent still arise. And where that happens, I think that might explain the reasons for the relatively lower conviction rate for rape as compared to other types of child sexual offences. But I'm speculating. I don't know whether that's really true. But I think it is true that there are still a number of difficulties in even getting a case to court, and that relates to the attitudes and the stereotyping of girls and young women that occurs in the earlier stages of the proceedings, where the police decide that a young woman or a girl won't be a reliable witness, or the Crown Prosecution Service decide that. Factors like whether she'd been drinking at the time are things they take into account. And research shows that's something that juries take into account as well, and they tend to have more victim-blaming attitudes when women or girls have been drinking. So all kinds of stereotypes and rape myths are still coming into play, particularly at the earlier stages of the criminal justice process. And what happens is that the witnesses who are seen as most likely to succeed in convincing the jury that they're telling the truth because they're seen as more respectable, are the ones who tend to get to court. And once they get there, the conviction rate is not significantly lower than for other offences, but many don't ever get there because of rape myths and sexual stereotyping. Thank you. Sorry for running over.
Now we're going with Jill Raymond, who is a reactivated web weaver and WDI activist, and she will tell us about the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. So thank you very much, Jill, and over to you.
I just introduced this report by reminding everyone that in 2006, Julie Bindle wrote her first article about grooming gangs in northern towns, naming the ethnicity of these gangs. The Sunday Times, The Independent, and The Guardian would not print her articles on the grounds of the danger of inflaming racial tensions in those towns. In 2007, Julie was put on the Islamophobic list by the left. The press silenced her, and many white feminists did not support her. Maggie Oliver is a former Greater Manchester detective constable who resigned in 2012 in order to expose the Rochdale gangs. In 2019, she established the Maggie Oliver Foundation, which supports victims and survivors. Holly Archer is now 38. For 4 years, from the age of 14, she was abused and raped by criminal gangs in Telford. Years later, in 2022, the Crowther inquiry and report revealed police failings. Holly had campaigned for 7 years for this inquiry. She now runs her Holly Project support organisation for survivors, which is backed by Telford and Wrekin Council. In 2015, Dr. Alex Jay began a 7-year statutory independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, ICSA. It cost £6 million to produce a 458-page report, which was published in October 2022. More than 7,000 victims took part in it. I will now be reading verbatim from the report. This is the executive summary introduction from Dr. Alexis J. This report is the final statutory report published by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, the Inquiry. In accordance with the terms of references, it sets out the main findings about the extent to which state and non-state institutions failed in their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation, and makes recommendations for reform. It draws on the inquiry's 15 investigations and 19 related investigation reports, including the interim report of the ICSA, and 41 other inquiry reports and publications. The inquiry has made 20 recommendations in this report. These final recommendations complement the 87 recommendations contained in the previously published investigation reports, including 6 which have been restated. There's a few more statistics. There are nearly 13 million children in England and Wales, each of whom needs and deserves to be protected from harm. Babies, toddlers, and children are potentially at risk, with current estimates indicating that 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 20 boys experience child sexual abuse before the age of 16. In March 2020, the Office for National Statistics estimated that 3.1 million adults in England and Wales had experienced sexual abuse before the age of 16. Reflecting the guiding principles that the child's welfare is paramount, the inquiry's recommendations are focused on making England and Wales places for children to grow up safely and thrive. I'm not going to read these next points out. It summarises the work of the inquiry over the past 7 years, and it demonstrates these list of things which the other speakers have already covered really clearly. So I will move on, but there's a little summary on the screen there of the same sort of things. I think I'll just reiterate that the final point is that this is not just a national crisis, but a global one. At the heart of this report are the inquiry's recommendations to help protect children. There needs to be greater priority and focus politically and across society as a whole on protecting children from sexual abuse. The establishment of the child protection authorities in England and Wales, coupled with national public awareness campaigns, are designed to ensure that the spotlight remains directly at preventing child sexual abuse. These recommendations will be reinforced by cabinet-level ministerial positions for children to provide senior leadership and increased priority within government. One of the aims of the public awareness campaign is to inform the public about the action they should take if they know or suspect a child is being sexually abused. This will complement the recommendation for a new law of mandatory reporting, making it a legal requirement for those who work in regulated activity or work in a position of trust to report child sexual abuse. The impact of past failures to protect children from sexual abuse and to support those who have been harmed is incalculable. To address this, the inquiry considers that a redress scheme must be established to make some reparations for the harm suffered. Background and context. The sexual abuse and exploitation of children is criminal and morally wrong. There is no excuse for those who perpetrate this crime. It has never been right or excusable whenever it has occurred. To a significant extent, this also applies to those who knew about the abuse but did nothing, as well as to those who actively covered it up or contrived to assist a perpetrator or from escaping justice or avoiding the scrutiny of statutory authorities. The extent of the global crisis in child sexual abuse and exploitation is manifest by the number of national and international institutional inquiries across the world, including the USA, Australia, Ireland, Germany, France, Spain, and Japan. In surveys, girls were at least 3 times as likely as boys to describe experiences of child sexual abuse. Disabled participants were twice as likely to describe such experiences as non-disabled participants. And those who lived in care home were nearly 4 times as likely to have experienced child sexual abuse. Those who had experienced childhood neglect were nearly 5 times as likely to have experienced child sexual abuse as those who had not. The inquiry also conducted a thematic investigation into child protection in religious organisations and settings. In total, 38 religious organisations, including Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, new religious movements, non-conformist Christian denominations, non-Trinitarian Christian dominations, paganism, and Sikhism, provided evidence to the inquiry. Respect for a diversity of beliefs is the hallmark of a liberal democracy, but can never be used to justify harm to a child. There were significant barriers to effective reporting of child sexual abuse, including victim blaming and the notion of shame and honour. In some religious traditions and communities, children are not taught about sex or sexual relationships. The inquiry was told by representatives of some faiths that in some languages there were no words for rape, sexual abuse, or genitalia. The victims' and survivors' voices uses the words of those who have been sexually abused to describe what happened to them. Some of the content is therefore explicit, but these experiences and perspectives are at the heart of this inquiry. Each account represents a life fundamentally altered and affected by the abuse. The harm brought about by sexual abuse cannot be overstated or ignored. Educational, familial relationships, sexual relationships, mental, emotional, and physical well-being, job prospects can all be affected. In some cases, it has driven victims to self-harm and even to take their own lives. It is difficult to imagine what it feels like to be silenced or dismissed when trying to tell someone that you have been sexually abused. This happens so often to victims and survivors that many gave up trying to report what had happened to them. That is why the Truth Project, designed to enable victims and survivors to share their accounts in a confidential setting, was such a vital part of the inquiry's work, and why victims and survivors' voices represents a cornerstone of the inquiry's analysis and recommendations. More than 6,200 victims and survivors contributed to the Truth Project. For some, it was the first time they had ever spoken about the child sexual abuse they had suffered. Across the inquiry's work, victims and survivors recounted the barriers they faced when reporting abuse. Many felt a deep sense of shame about what had been done to them. They worried about the consequences of reporting abuse. Some victims and survivors were too young at the time of the abuse to recognise what was happening to them, or that it was abusive. Some did not have the vocabulary to describe that abuse. Accounts revealed how sexual abuse was often accompanied by physical abuse or neglect at home. Many of the acts perpetrated caused agonizing physical pain. Most inflicted by abusers who was known to the victim and who they trusted. The inquiry heard how it was difficult for many victims and survivors to report what was happening to them and how they were ignored or not taken seriously. Many victims and survivors who contributed to the inquiry's work were motivated to share their accounts in order to try to help other children being abused. As a result, this report starts with the victims and survivors. As well as contributions made to public hearings, victims and survivors assisted the inquiry through the Victim Survivor Consultative Panel and the Victims and Survivors Forum. Engagement was enhanced by discussion with young people, the LGBTQI+ communities, and specialist organisations assisting victims of child sexual abuse from ethnic minority communities. Each group describes particular concerns, but common themes emerged that were reflected throughout the inquiry's work. Lack of trust in institutions that were supposed to help, and a failure to understand, respond appropriately to the impact of sexual abuse, as well as the cultural and other related issues. Victims and survivors' voices used the words of those who have been sexually abused to describe what happened to them. Some of the content is therefore explicit, but these experiences and perspectives are at the heart of this inquiry. These are from Part B of the report, and it's titled, Why I Choose to Share My Experience. I want to somehow represent people that didn't have a voice, that weren't considered. I want to protect people that it potentially could happen to in the future. That was from a participant of the residential schools investigation. Alf said, I just wanted to get my story out, to illustrate how violence and sexual abuse can affect a child and what to look out for. Lisa is deaf and came to the Truth Project because she wanted to be listened to and believed. Holly said, I can now say I'm finally being heard and can grieve for the person I might have been if I had not been a victim of child abuse. I'm 65 and the Truth Project is the first support I've had in my whole life where I can actually tell a story. So I've waited a very long time for this. That was from a participant from the Ethnic Minority Communities Research. Janine said, I'm doing this for my 5-year-old me. From the age of 6, Humara was sexually abused, including being raped by her older brother. She believed her parents knew about the abuse because they eventually sent him away to live with a relative. Ashley thought it was a disclosure of a previous sexual abuse, which made her choir master decide to exploit her vulnerability. And finally, Lionel explained that he did not want being sexually abused as a child to define him. He felt it was possible for victims and survivors to overcome child sexual abuse.
In Canadian news this week, Redux has reported that a self-described kink-allied psychologist who worked with vulnerable youth in Calgary is now facing child pornography charges. 45-year-old Dustin Reichen was arrested on January 30th by the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Team, or ALERT's, Internet Child Exploitation Unit. Reichen has been charged with possessing and disseminating child pornography through the online social media application Kik. A now-deleted online profile posted to Psychology Today listed Reichen as a sex-positive, kink-allied, queer-allied, transgender-allied, and non-monogamy expert offering counseling services to teens and adults. It is unclear at this time whether any of his adolescent patients were subjected to his abuse and exploitation. In other news, Redux also revealed this week that trans-identified man Nathaniel Morin, who is advisor to the Minister of Women and Gender Equality, Marcy Ian, and who claimed on X that trans-identified men do not have an advantage over women in sports, had previously dominated while running in the women's category in a 5-kilometer race. Morin took to social media last week in response to President Trump's executive order protecting women and girls in sport, sharing infographics made by another trans-identified man who also competes in the women's category in sports, stating that, quote, trans women do not have an advantage and biological diversity is everywhere. It's interesting that Maureen would post such a clownish take, especially considering that in February of 2024, he competed in a women's 5K in Ottawa, finishing a whopping 5 minutes and 44 seconds ahead of the female who was awarded second place. Finally, I attended the CCOHR, or Continuing Committee of Officials on Human Rights meeting on CEDAW last Thursday. As I mentioned last week, they disabled the chat and were only allowing questions to be asked through the Q&A tab. I posted the following question because there were several women present who are meant to be advocating for the rights of Canadian women and girls. It has been reported that a trans-identifying male has been charged with sexually assaulting at least 4 women at a women's shelter in Edmonton in August. Considering the fact that this is not the first or even second time this has happened due to self-identification policies, is there any consideration being given to finding a solution that protects women from predatory males taking advantage of self-ID? At this time, the only female-only rape relief center in Canada is Vancouver Rape Relief, and they have had their government funding pulled as a result of the center accommodating females exclusively. It is crucial for many traumatized women to be assured that they will be treated by and housed with females. Is there anyone in a position to advocate for women and girls, taking into consideration the needs of these women? This question was asked by Dr. Hacker at Canada's CEDAW appearance, but was ignored. Every single question asked in the Q&A that day was answered except for mine. And I think that speaks volumes to the selective advocacy displayed by the supposed feminist organizations funded by the Canadian government. There was a representative from Wage there who, of course, had no answers for me. But I will continue to attend these meetings because I think it's important that these people know that WDI is here and we're paying attention. And I also think that it's valuable to pass on information to these people that the mainstream media is not covering. I think these are the people who need to hear this information the most.
As you may have noticed, events here in the US have been transpiring quickly. Try as I might to limit the length of my briefings, doing so is often impossible with so much going on, and I apologize in advance for the length of today's report. I'll begin by sharing that the recording of our recent webinar, How the Trans Lobby Co-opted the Struggle for Black American Civil Rights, is now available on WDI USA's YouTube channel. Moving on, the biggest news rocking our world this week is that on February 5th, National Girls and Women's in Sports Day, President Trump signed an executive order titled Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports. In Section 1, Policy and Purpose, the order declares it is the policy of the U.S. to rescind all funds from educational programs that deprive women and girls of fair athletic opportunities, which results in the endangerment, humiliation, and silencing of women and girls and deprives them of privacy. It shall also be the policy of the U.S. to oppose male competitive participation in women's sports more broadly as a matter of safety, fairness, dignity, and truth. Section 3A directs the Secretary of Education to take all appropriate action to affirmatively protect all female athletic opportunities and all female locker rooms, and to prioritize Title IX enforcement actions against institutions, including athletic associations, that deny female students an equal opportunity to participate in sports and athletic events. Section 3B states that all executive departments and agencies shall review grants to educational programs and, where appropriate, rescind funding to those that fail to comply with the order. And 3C, that the Department of Justice shall provide all necessary resources to relevant agencies to ensure expeditious enforcement. Section 4A directs the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy to convene representatives of major athletic organizations and governing bodies and female athletes harmed by such policies to promote those that are fair and safe in the best interest of female athletes and consistent with Title IX, and to convened state attorneys general to identify best practices for women as well. Section 4B and C directs the secretaries of state and homeland security to take various actions, including at the UN, to protect the sex-based female sports category internationally. At the White House signing ceremony, Trump said that his administration will not stand by and watch men beat and batter female athletes at the 2028 Summer Games set to take place in Los Angeles, and that he's directed Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem to deny any and all visa applications submitted by male athletes who identify as women to fraudulently enter the US to try and get into the games. Right out of the gate, the US Department of Education got busy with the aforementioned enforcement actions with its announcements that the department's Office of Civil Rights, OCR, is launching directed investigations into San Jose State University, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association for apparent Title IX violations. Additionally, OCR is actively reviewing athletic participation policies at a number of schools to evaluate their alignment with Title IX protections for female athletes. On February 5th, Icons issued a press release announcing that 3 former UPenn swimmers have filed a new lawsuit against the NCAA, Ivy League Conference, and Harvard University, citing harassment, abuse, and federal law violations resulting from the NCAA and Ivy League's decision to allow male swimmer Leah Will Thomas to compete on the UPenn women's team and access women's locker rooms during the 2021 and 2022 season. The suit, backed and supported by Icons on behalf of Grace Estabrook, Ellen Holmquist, and Margot Kazarowski, claims that the NCAA and Ivy League fostered a culture of intimidation while forcing young women to deny biological reality, jeopardizing their opportunities, privacy, and safety in violation of Title IX. Encouragingly, on the same day, NCAA President Charlie Barker issued a statement saying that the Board of Governors would be reviewing the executive order and will take necessary steps to align NCAA policy, and proceeded to announce its new transgender student athlete participation policy on February 6th. Unfortunately, while the policy is a step in the right direction, it is by no means one that comprehensively protects women. For one, it uses ideological rather than biological language, such as a student athlete assigned to male at birth may not compete on a women's team, but does not address how male athletes with a DSD, such as Iman Khalif, who were erroneously assigned female at birth, will be classified. Secondly, it allows males to practice on the team consistent with their gender identity and receive all other benefits applicable to student athletes, which could direct limited resources away from eligible females. The policy also fails to address what locker rooms such males would have access to, nor does it mention whether or not female athletes would be informed should their practices include men. Perhaps most alarmingly, the press release issued by the NCAA about the change includes the statement that individual schools have the autonomy to determine athletics participation on their campuses, which may very well allow for a sanctuary university position. So yeah, while welcome, the new policy needs work. As I mentioned last week, hospitals coast to coast have reportedly taken action to avoid threatened sanctions and loss of federal funds by suspending so-called gender-affirming care for clients under the age of 19. Closer to home for me, that includes Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, which initially began to cancel its gender health clinic appointments, but has since resumed them after a group of families and doctors filed suit, backed by the ACLU, against the Trump administration, claiming that his EOs defending women and protecting children are unlawful and unconstitutional. At least 2 state attorneys general, Letitia James in New York and Rob Bonta in California, have issued letters warning hospitals that withholding such care would be a violation of their respective states' anti-discrimination laws. Additionally, a coalition of 15 state AGs, including Wisconsin's Josh Kaul, recently issued a joint statement that denounced Trump's order as wrong on the science and the law, asserts that a recent court order affirmed that the Trump administration cannot halt funding through administrative memos or executive orders, threatened further legal action if the administration continues to impede this critical funding, and reiterated their commitment to enforce state laws. In a Substack published yesterday, Kara mentions another lawsuit filed on the 7th by 3 attorneys general from the blue states of Washington, Oregon, and Minnesota, along with 3 anonymous doctors against the Trump administration's Protecting Children EO, which halts federal funding for the medicalization of minors. Kara's post points to an X thread by attorney Glenna Goldis eviscerating the complaint, which is well worth a review. And finally, also on the 7th, Wolf published news that federal district courts in Boston and DC have issued temporary restraining orders preventing the transfer of male federal Bureau of Prison inmates who claim a woman identity to male prisons in response to separate complaints alleging Trump's defending women EO is unconstitutional because it violates the provision against cruel or unusual punishment. As always, women's needs were not considered in these decisions. And that's all I have today. Thank you.
Suspended because she's the nurse who was suspended because she asked a male doctor who was in the changing room to leave. Or actually, I don't think she even asked him to leave. She told him that he made her uncomfortable, and he then complained about her, and she was suspended. And although I think she then went back to work for a while, she has taken an employment tribunal case against the health board and has named him as the second respondent. And I was up in Dundee. I finally managed to get up there today. The case is being heard in Dundee instead of Edinburgh. And he's just comes over as the most self-absorbed, I mean, this won't come as a surprise, I'm sure, but the most self-absorbed, narcissistic man. He's very, very manipulative as well. So he was always trying to get the better of Naomi Cunningham, who's Sandy's barrister. And I think, you know, maybe his attitude was summed up because when she put to him, well, you know, if a woman, she was just talking about a hypothetical woman, you know, if a woman, say with heavy menstrual bleeding or heavy bleeding or something, came into A&E, because he's an A&E doctor, and asked to see a female doctor, do you think it would be acceptable to have you assigned to her? And he said, yes, that would be absolutely fine, because if she wasn't happy with me, she could tell me. And I mean, I would never want to, you know, look after somebody who wasn't happy about it, and I would go and get a different doctor for her. And didn't seem to have any notion that this would not be really the right way to do it, because, you know, women in that situation aren't often very confident to challenge a doctor that's supposed to be seeing them and treating them. But he was completely convinced that women don't know that he's a man. He kept insisting that he doesn't use the word passes, but he kept insisting that nobody realizes that his trans history, and everybody thinks he's a woman. So I don't think he really believed that this hypothetical woman would know who he was. And when he was pressed a little bit further on it, he said, well, yes, you know, because if that wasn't the right way to do it, then the only alternative would be that, you know, he or whoever would, every time they met a patient, would have to introduce themselves, not just with their name, but with their gender identity and their sexuality, and ask if she was comfortable being seen by them, which is ridiculous. Because of course, if you just give a woman doctor when she's asked for it, that's all that's necessary. So there wasn't actually the hearing only went on really this morning. Last Friday, it became apparent that Fife Health Board had failed to produce a lot of documents that they were supposed to produce. Sandy had been, this case is partly about the investigation that they carried out into her. And it transpired on Friday that there had actually been a previous investigation, which it looks like somebody concluded that her suspension was disproportionate, and the female changing rooms should be made female again, or that there was some suggestion of that. Anyway, I'm not quite clear what the status of that document was, but that was all not mentioned. That was never produced. So Friday was completely lost to the hearing while there was all this discussion about paperwork. And then today, something that Upton, the doctor, said made it clear that there's more paperwork that hasn't been produced that should have done, an email trail that emails between himself and the British Medical Association. So again, the whole hearing was stopped while those emails had to be produced, and then there was at least 20 pages of emails, and so the afternoon hearing didn't go ahead. And it was very interesting because the there's one barrister for Fife and Upton. Apparently that's not uncommon when the employer supports the second respondent, but anyway, there's only one barrister involved, and she's obviously very keen that none of this is investigated. And she was saying, you know, the thing is, you know, Naomi Cunningham's trying to find a smoking gun and she'll never find one, which does really rather raise the possibility that there is indeed one to be found. But I mean, we don't know for a fact. You know, if and when all the paperwork is finally produced, then, you know, we might get to the bottom of it. I've been fascinated by the extent to which Naomi's had to be acting really as a detective as much as a barrister, because there's just, they found little crumbs. They would be in a paper, there was some comment made that they couldn't make sense of, and when they looked, they realized it must mean that there was some other paper that they hadn't seen, and then they would ask for that, and then there was another crumb and another crumb. So it's been a big bit of detective work. So the result is the hearing was set to last 2 weeks, so it should finish on this Friday, but because of all these delays, and also because it means that there's more questions to be put, in fact, what's going to happen is it won't finish this week. They'll hear a couple more witnesses this week, and then there'll have to be an adjournment until a time, which could be certainly weeks and possibly even months away, before they can find a time that everybody can manage, which is, you know, very unsatisfactory, I think, for everybody concerned. So there certainly won't be a decision in that case anytime soon. I think one thing that was interesting today was in the Westminster Parliament, Rosie Duffield asked the minister whether she thought it was appropriate for the NHS to expect their female staff to undress in front of men in changing rooms, or words to that effect. And the minister stood up and said no and sat down again. So that suggests that maybe they're aware of this case, and maybe they realize that, you know, it's not really playing out very well. It does look as if this case is piquing quite a lot of people. You see the reporting in the media has a different tone than it's had in the past, which I think is all very good. The other thing that Shirley, my colleague from WDI, who was also at the hearing today with me, drew my attention to, which I hadn't known about, is that Fife NHS have a toolkit for their staff writing equality impact assessments, and in that there's a chart which lists, you know, the protected characteristics which are under the Equality Act, which they correctly list, and then the sort of second column is, you know, the people who should be targeted for equality action, I suppose. So you have men and women, and then you have minority ethnic groups, and you have disabled people and gay men and lesbian people. So I can only assume that they must have had Mr. Upton in mind, because, you know, he's married to a woman, so he presumably considers himself a lesbian, although that hasn't been discussed in court. So that's just, I mean, it's a bit silly, really. I think wearing my lesbian persistence hat, we might write to Fife Health Board and complain about the fact that we've been reduced to people rather than women. Obviously, that's supposed to be an all-encompassing category. So I think that's all I've got for now.
There's a number of legislative proposals in the books in New Zealand at the moment, which affect women's sex-based rights. And one of them is the Stalking and Harassment Bill. And submissions are due for that actually tomorrow. So that's sort of fairly urgent for anyone who in New Zealand listening to this that wants to make a submission. And I imagine that a number of gender critical feminists have made submissions, and including the Women's Rights Party. And the Women's Rights Party submission is now on their website, and I'll post a link to that in the comments. So this bill looks good at first sight, because of who wouldn't want to protect women from stalking and harassment, and that's a good aim. However, the wording is so vague that a woman who objects to a man in her space or doesn't affirm his gender identity could be prosecuted for so-called stalking and harassment if she does it more than once. Says he's a man. The Women's Rights Party is calling for the wording to be more specific, and for the real risk of violence and or serious impediment to a woman's daily life should be included in the definition of stalking. Now, another bill which is on the cards is called the Paiora Healthy Futures 3-Day Postnatal Stay Amendment Bill. Now, this also has good intentions, which is to ensure that women get at least 3 days in a hospital if they give birth in hospital to be cared for afterwards, because at the moment many are having to go home very quickly after giving birth simply because there aren't enough beds or people there to care for them. So it's a good aim. However, there are many factors where this is not quite as good as it looks. The Women's Rights Party have also put a submission in about this. They support the intention to guarantee care for women, but say that more support is needed at home as well. Also, more resources should be put into primary care, such as birthing units. Staying in hospital is not always the best option, especially when the New Zealand maternity hospitals are under-resourced. And women often, simply get moved out from where they gave birth. And if they give birth in an actual public hospital, they often, after birth, get moved to a primary care unit, which would have been, many of them could have been in the primary care unit in the first place. That's like a birthing centre. So that's that piece of legislation. Now, another piece is the Mental Health Bill, which the Women's Rights Party made a submission to this in December last year, and today they are presenting an oral submission, which will eventually be up on the parliamentary submissions website. And again, the party agrees with the intention of the bill, which is to reduce coercive practices towards mental health patients, especially those in compulsory treatment, and to give patients more autonomy and choices. But the party disagrees with some of the language, the use of the word gender and gender identity instead of sex, and the word sexual preferences instead of sexual orientation. The bill states that a person cannot be deemed to have a serious mental illness on the grounds of, quote, gender identity or, quote, sexual preferences alone. However, the term sexual preferences could include fetishes and paraphilias, which sometimes are forms of mental illness. or even may involve criminal activity. Using the term sexual orientation instead would affirm and support the rights of lesbian, bisexual and gay patients who are probably meant to be included under that term in the bill, but not actually specifically named. So the bill also says that a mental health tribunal, which makes decisions about what happens to the patients, should co-opt someone of the same, quote, gender identity as the patient. The Women's Rights Party says that this should be someone of the same sex. They should use the word sex there, not gender identity. So the party calls for clear factual language and to use the terms sex and sexual orientation. The submission has been submitted and it's been posted online, so I'll show you a link to that. And this is a lot of news from the Women's Rights Party, I know, because this is what I'm aware of is going on right now. I'm sure the other gender critical groups are probably doing other things, but it hasn't sort of reached the public eye yet. So there's the Law Commission is going to meet with the Women's Rights Party. And I'm sure they will be meeting with Speak Up for Women as well regarding proposed hate crime legislation. So there's a bit more time to submit to that. The submissions close on the 13th of March. And I said last time that we need to look at that with a fine-tooth comb because we know how the concepts of hate crime and hate speech can be twisted around against women who say that a man is not a woman. However, there are some good elements in this bill, so I will get back to you about that when we have developed our submission about it. And also the Women's Rights Party has been invited to meet a representative from the Human Rights Commission. They wrote last year when they liked some work that a Pacifica commissioner had done at an international meeting. She's no longer working there, but the Women's Rights Party have been invited to speak to a commissioner, and they're hoping to speak with Stephen Rainbow, who is the new Human Rights Commissioner. Now, he is a gay man, and he's the son of a gender-critical feminist and lesbian, Jill Abigail. He did previously, before being appointed, warn in the gay community against conflating trans issues with gay issues. So that looks quite promising, but he has to be, I think, as a Human Rights Commissioner, a bit careful what he says now. So, but we would like to talk to him. So see if we can get the Human Rights Commission in general to change its stance, because in general it has been very pro-gender, and it also has a lot of stuff on its website which actually gives misinformation about our current laws, for example, about births, deaths and marriages legislation, and whether, because in fact in that law, the birth certificate, it's admitted that the birth certificate is not an actual proof of someone's sex, whereas the Human Rights Commission website gives the impression that it can be seen that way. So we need to talk with them about all that. And lastly, I just want to mention a woman called Jackie Scott, who I've just read, she died today, and that's very sad news. She was one of the first women to raise awareness of the harms of pelvic mesh in New Zealand. She was a rape survivor, and she suffered greatly for many years from mesh and ceaselessly campaigned against it. So several years ago, she was trying to get the Accident Compensation Commission, which is something we have in New Zealand. We call it ACC for short, and it helps provide funding for people to have treatments after they've experienced accidents or assaults. And she asked them to help her with funding to go to the United States to get the mesh removed, because there's nobody in New Zealand who had the skills to remove it. But they refused. However, she did eventually manage to get there by doing online fundraising. But even after getting it removed, she continued to suffer a lot from the effects of the mesh. And anyway, unfortunately, now she has died. And I regard her as a pioneer for women's health in New Zealand. And after she raised the issue, there was a whole campaign that built up against the mesh. And there is currently a pause of the use of mesh in New Zealand. So that's all today. Thank you.
because it's not a legal filing or a public hearing, but there are reports that 2 ACT-based psychologists have received complaints from the ACT Human Rights Commission accusing them of conducting conversion therapy because they provide exploratory therapy to youth diagnosed with gender dysphoria rather than just affirming them. If these complaints have been made, the Commission will investigate and private conciliation may be held. If lawsuits are filed, they would be some of the first conversion therapy in lawsuits in Australia. They could be either criminal or civil because the Act provides for both. So we'll see if there's more information on that. In June last year, the Australian E-Safety Commissioner had a tweet by an Australian woman, Celine, geo-blocked in Australia. The tweet was about the existence of a queer club in a primary school. Celine questioned whether this was appropriate for primary age children. She contacted the Free Speech Union and they filed an appeal against the takedown notice. The Commissioner argued that they had only issued an informal notice and it therefore couldn't be legally challenged. On the 6th of February, just gone, the Administrative Review Tribunal found that these notices could be reviewed and expressed concern with the practice of sending complaint alerts rather than formal removal notices, because notices give reasons while alerts do not. Justice Kiru found that the alerts deprived users of one of the features of balance that the law strikes between the community's right to free speech and its right to be protected from cyber abuse material. Also on the 6th of February, the Federal Parliament passed its hate speech amendments, with the Senate only taking 5 minutes to pass the bill, 41 in favour, 6 against. The new law expands hate speech to cover grounds including gender identity, intersex status, sexual orientation, and political opinion, and includes mandatory imprisonment for offences involving displaying Nazi symbolism or symbols of recognised terrorist organisations. The law makes it a hate crime offence to threaten force or violence against a group or member of a group, or incite or advocate someone else to, if a reasonable member of the target group would fear the threat would be carried out. So interestingly, the law could cut multiple ways, as lesbians and feminists, for instance, also ought to be protected from threats. Kiralee Smith, co-founder of the advocacy group Binary Australia, is currently in the Sydney local court on a claim of vilification. I think she said it was her 8th court appearance in relation to a range of different claims made against her. This one was brought by a New South Wales man, Stephanie Blanche, a man who claims a transgender identity and was used by Kiralee as an example of a man playing in women's sports. Kiralee is arguing the constitutional freedom of political communication as part of her defence, which meant that the tribunal lacked jurisdiction and the matter was removed to a court. She was cross-examined last week by Blanche's lawyers, and questions included things like, you don't care how the plaintiff feels or care about her? Don't you think it's unreasonable? No matter what he says, you will always refer to her as he or him. So you don't believe men can become women? I put it to you, women can have Adam's apples. Did you consider she was living as a woman? And did you use the plaintiff's dead name? The decision is due on the 7th of May, and Kiralee is back in court on the 14th of April on a similar matter brought by another man, Riley Dennis, who also plays on women's teams and has been used by Kiralee as an example of that policy. On the 30th of January, the Federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Anna Cody, issued a statement criticising the Queensland Government's decision to pause Tanner Stage 1 and 2 interventions on children until an independent review is conducted. So this would just be in the state of Queensland. She described these interventions as a fundamental human right that children would be denied and warned that restricting access would cause trauma to children. She said that the Australian Human Rights Commission would be contacting the Queensland Government with their concerns. On the 30th of January also, a letter was published from doctors, lawyers, politicians, child psychiatrists and campaigners to the federal government, calling on them to launch an inquiry into puberty blockers and to halt interventions while the review was underway. On the 31st of January, so the day after the letter and 3 days after the Queensland announcement, the federal Labor government did announce an overhaul of the national guidelines for childhood medical interventions based on gender. The national guidelines are influential on the states, but the states control the actual laws in the area. The federal health minister said that this expert committee would include people with lived experience and that it would work with trans organisations. He said the interim guidelines would be due in 2026, with no pause on interventions during that time. And the minister said that since the national review should take precedence, Queensland should halt its own inquiry in favour of the federal one and resume giving Tanner stage 1 and 2 interventions. Queensland did not agree with that. It is going ahead with its inquiry and its pause on interventions. Organisations, interestingly, including Equality Australia, AusPath, Transcend Australia and LGBTIQ+ Health Australia are supporting the federal government's review. They are not supporting the Queensland one. And lastly, on the 10th of February, One Nation MP Pauline Hanson moved again in the Senate for an independent federal review into childhood gender interventions. This is her last opportunity before the federal election this year. She moved that it be referred to the Community Affairs References Committee for inquiry and report by the 26th of March this year, and it was voted down again, but this time 36 to 21, so a closer margin. Thank you very much.